Kia ora tātou. I am Sarah McKibben. Thank you, Bill, for the introduction. And before I jump into the social side of school reform, I have to thank some of my own social side that has really been really instrumental in my time here in New Zealand. So my hosts at Victoria University have been such mentors for me. I've really enjoyed being the American consultant. I've enjoyed being the American consultant on the Dominion Post quiz, so thank you for that. I have also really been indebted to Fulbright and the Fulbright New Zealand staff for making me feel at home here immediately and for giving me a good grounding here in New Zealand. And again, Bill said it, but a big thank you to Melee as she transfers into her new role. And I know in no small part you helped me get here, so thank you for that. To get a big thank you before I get into this to all of the educators and the policy folks who opened their doors to me and really were just incredibly generous in saying, yes, you can come visit my school. Yes, I will give you an hour of my time. Yes, please come see what our students are doing. That is a huge, that just speaks volumes about the educators here in New Zealand and the passion that you bring to your craft. And I am enough compelled that I'm going into teaching after this. So thank you very much for your showing me the beauty and the passion of teaching and learning. Another aspect of the social side, to get a sense of who I'm talking to, if you are in some way participating in learning and change, either as an educator or on the policy side of things, could you raise your hand? Okay, so we have some familiarity already. If you are affiliated with the ministry in any way, do you mind raising your hand? Just to get a sense of who's here. If you are an educator not affiliated with LCN, get a sense. Okay, so we've got a bit of a mix. And then if you're just here for the refreshments, don't tell me that. So, I know it's you. So I'm here today to talk about the social side of school reform, and we're going to look at that through a specific model here in New Zealand, the Learning and Change Network strategy. An assumption that Learning and Change and I share, and a research-based one, is that educational change doesn't happen unless you pay attention to the social fabric it's impacting, unless you pay attention to the social situations that govern classrooms, that govern schools, that govern communities. And so I am attempting to make that visual in some ways in my year here. But before we jump into that, for those who aren't so familiar with the LCN strategy, let's go through that first. What is a Learning and Change Network? And I hope at the end of this, if I've missed something, that those involved will put in your 2 cents. At its most basic, it's a group of schools working together to grow capability to accelerate achievement of priority learners. And we've talked about, Bill mentioned, priority learners generally being students achieving below national standards, typically Māori and Pacifica students or students from low-income backgrounds or students with special education needs, but not exclusively so. Schools have some freedom to choose who they focus on. Right now, the Learning and Change Networks, there are 53 networks nationwide, about 286 schools. Last I checked, that's of July, I believe, as of July. What's unique about this partnership, about 3/4 of the schools in New Zealand are already involved in some kind of collaborative cluster, whether ESAS or LPDP or a manner of other acronyms involved in specific strategies. What's interesting about Learning and Change, there are many things, but one of them is that it's a unique partnership between not just schools, but also bringing in their communities and bringing in the Ministry of Education in a more direct role, perhaps, than in the past, and working with the University of Auckland as a facilitation team. As Bill mentioned, the Learning and Change Networks are one of 5 pilot projects internationally selected by the OECD as an innovative learning environment project. The idea being changing learning environments to improve student learning. Part of that being a 21st century approach, part of it simply being very 20th, 19th century approaches to teaching and learning. Before we get into this, when we talk about what a learning environment is, this will be a familiar map to some of you, but think about in your everyday life, when we think about what a learning environment is, when you go to your office or when you do the work that you do every day, think about the people that you turn to learn about that work and to help you improve in that work. Think about the sites that you do it. It may not just be your office. It may be, it could be church. It could be the street corner, wherever it is that you're improving your practice. And think about the tools that you use to access and improve in that learning. That may be a laptop, that may be a book, that may be whatever it may be. And thinking about the connections between those things. If you consider all of these together, we get your learning environment. And it's important to note that there are, of course, things that you may not be aware of that are impacting that. But this gives us a little bit of a picture. And so what the Learning and Change Networks uses as a bit of a hook to kind of communicate what we mean by learning environments is having students do these learning maps. This one is an example of a young man in the Wellington region and how he views his learning environment. So you see some people around, you see his teachers, his students, sister, dad, his friend Carl. You can see some of the Chromebooks or laptops around that he uses to access learning. And you can see arrows communicating direction of information. So he either learns from this person or he might contribute learning to this person. This is the first map that he did before he actually went through some of the Learning and Change Network pieces. So over time, this would shift. And what Learning and Change Networks use this map for is kind of a way of measuring and making visual some of those changes so that over time you can do this map again and again and again and see if the student feels like they have more agency in their learning, if the student is engaging with more people than they have in the past, or if they're engaging with them in new ways. This map helps you look at that. LCN overall, as a part of that learning environment idea, is shifting from a supply-driven mindset, where there's kind of an expertise, and for your PD, you're going to be receiving whatever this expertise is, to a demand-driven service where schools are saying, well, we need this right now. How can you help us do that? And students are saying, I need this learning right now. How can you, teacher, help me do that? Or how can you, dad, help me do that? It's an agency way of looking at things, building ownership. So when we say moving from supply-driven to demand-driven services with a strong involvement of students, families, and whānau in those conversations. The networks have flexibility in choosing what they focus on, but the most popular ones have been family and whānau connections, student agency, like I talked about, building ownership, cultural responsiveness, bringing culture into the classroom and acknowledging that learning happens outside of the classroom, and future-focused learning, so more about not just the technology, but actually the pedagogy behind the technology, and what new digital strategies enable for us in a new way of learning. So once a group of schools signs on to be an LCN, they go through this cycle, which for schools that have been involved in a schooling improvement process, this will look familiar, but there's some key differences. So what schools work with a facilitator to learn what to change, plan the change, actually change things, and then check the impact of that change, all in the service of a student achievement challenge, which could be something like improving writing for Māori students or improving maths for Pacifica students, et cetera, et cetera. What's different about this from the past is that families and students, families and whānau and students in the community are brought into this process in a very intimate way at every stage, and are asked to actually do the analysis with the school leadership team in a way that hasn't previously been done in the past, and so it creates, again, that ownership and agency. Last fun diagram, and then we'll get into things. It's really important to note that network leadership meetings, which is where I've been focusing, are not, in fact, actual network leadership activity, or network activity, rather. The actual power of LCN is what happens in schools, or what happens with students. So each of these, if we think about this, each of these is a school that's doing its own work on that cycle. The network leadership team is really steering some of that work and setting the direction of it, but whatever they're doing is only in service of the bigger work that's happening in schools. But what I'm looking at, and what I've focused on this year, has been how do the dynamics and the ways that the network leaders work together influence what happens down here. So with that in mind, that's the idea and the concept and the theory behind learning and change networks. What I've been looking at is what's happening on the ground, or rather in the network leadership teams. Does that theory, has that come into practice, really? So in service of that question of how do the dynamics of the leadership team influence the collaboration throughout the network, I worked with 9 different learning and change networks, total of 63 schools. That doesn't mean that I visited every one of those schools, but I at least had some contact with the leaders of these schools. For each of those networks, I interviewed deputy principals, at times teachers, for a total of 44 interviews with those network leaders, as well as with policymakers and Ministry of Education folks and facilitators involved in the strategy. I observed network leadership team meetings. I went to regional networking days between the networks, and I did several school visits as well, though not in a systematic way. For 7 of those 9 networks, I did what we'll get into soon, which is a network analysis survey. So when I say network analysis, it's kind of like if you think about that learning map, which is done from the eyes of a student, or from the eyes of one person looking out. A network analysis survey asks about the quantity and the quality of the relationships among the networks. So it's kind of like a quasi-omniscient view of what's going on in a network, a snapshot. So network analysis allows us to see some of those dynamics that an individual person might not be able to say about their network. In many cases, leaders, I think, will find these to be consistent with their perceptions, but it does highlight some things about what's the dynamics of the group. So with that in mind, for 7 of those, I did network analysis surveys, was looking at things like trust. I asked a series of surveys about how, do you feel safe in this environment? Are you willing to share data with each other? Do you feel like you could call up somebody in this group and have an open conversation with them? I asked questions about challenge. Do you feel like people are asking tough questions about evidence in these network meetings? Do you feel like there's somebody likely to challenge the thinking of the group frequently? Questions like that. And asked questions about distributed leadership. Does this feel like more of a principal-owned network? Is this a teacher-owned network? Or somewhere in between? So with that in mind, let's get to some more diagrams. So this will require some unpacking, first off. But this is the result of a typical network analysis survey that I would put together. So what you're looking at right now, each of these shapes is a person in network H, and each of the lines between the people is a close relationship, which I defined as somebody that you would share personal information with or share time informally with. And so what we're looking at with network H, I'm going to take some time to do 2 case studies to look at 2 different networks and how they're similar and how they're different in lieu of doing all 7 to give us a sense of the things that I'm looking for. So each of these is a person, each of these things is a shape, is a tie, and each of these shapes indicates the role of each of these people. So the squares are principals, the diamonds are assistant principals or deputy principals, and the circles are teachers. So keep in mind this is a snapshot of a given point in time, but it does tell us some interesting information. And apologies to those in the back where this may be difficult to see. What's really striking about this network, number one, it's very dense. There are a lot of ties happening. This is a network that talks to each other a lot. They were off the charts on trust. They were also off the charts on challenge. I asked them to name the person in the group who is most challenging to the group's discussions. What's interesting about this network is that 4 or 5 people came through out of that. It wasn't any one person. It was actually evenly spread across the group, which will be important, and we'll compare it in a minute. You also see that the leadership is distributed in this group. The center person is not a principal, but in fact a deputy principal. There's actually 2. And then you see the colors, I should mention, are schools. So where you see kind of like up here, there's a group of red schools, or rather, that's one school that's in red. Over here, you see turquoise, that's another school, but they're not completely off in their own corner. They're actually quite integrated. So what that tells me is that the relationships and the conversations that are happening are not only happening in little clusters of schools or within schools, but actually happening across the network. And so when we look at this, not only from the close relationships perspective, because the personal doesn't necessarily imply the professional, this is the same network, but looking at who they turn to for advice. So in the center, you again see some of these deputy principals, and also very, very dense. Not as dense as the close relationships, but also pretty frequent conversations happening around advice. There's a few people off to the sides, off to kind of a periphery, especially like this green nugget over here. But generally, this is a pretty active network. So the types of things when I talked with this network that came out, quotes about this was the most meaningful project I've been a part of, those types of things. Teachers are frequently observing each other's practice. Students have actually gotten together. Teachers have brought together groups of students to talk about their learning. And some interesting things that have come out of this as well. If you look up at the top, there's a little orange circle, and that person is not super connected to the group. However, had some really great ideas around ways to engage with parents. And though this person was fairly quiet and wasn't talking that much about it, one of the key people in the middle picked up on this, and because of that key person's connections, was able to elevate that to the level of the group's discussion, and then suddenly now all of these schools are using a lot of this person's ideas to work with parents in a really meaningful way, and are having parent nights with learning conversations about, how can I work with my student in maths, for instance, those types of things. So the power of networking is really quite evident in this network. So compare that with a second network, which I want to clarify is not by any means a dysfunctional network, but is a network that's a work in progress, that is working towards the cohesion of networking, really. So when you look at this network, you see a little bit more spread. It's not quite as tight in the middle. There's a really key person right here. This is a principal right here that it seems like everyone is talking to. Everyone has a close relationship with. This is the guy. And he's the formal leader of the network and is very much playing a glue kind of role with people. Very skilled facilitator, really has a knack for things. But what you'll notice if you look at this is that there's still major clusters of schools. So over here you have all in the pink, that's one school. Up here you have purple, you have turquoise over here. Each of these is an individual school, and there's not a lot of, there is talking across the schools, but not in a really systemic way like the way that you would see if we go back here. So what that tells me is that this is a group of schools that is learning to be a network rather than a group of schools in some ways. And when I talk with and interviewed folks in this network, I got a lot of things about, we're really energetic, we really feel like we have some momentum. They had done some great work bringing teachers together for joint PD sessions. But when I talked with several of them about, we'll have our teachers in each other's classrooms and observing, and in pretty much every situation I got, oh, we're not ready for that yet. We want to start with joint PD and then maybe build into that. Also, what's interesting about this, when I asked the question about who's most likely to challenge the conversation in the network, one person popped out very, very clearly over here in the corner. Not the leader, but somebody over here in the corner, this little green box, green person. And so what's interesting about that is, and in observing the meetings, there was a real push and pull between these two people in a positive way that ensured that some real discussion was happening. But many of the schools that I talked with that were on this periphery around the outside didn't seem to feel the same kind of buy-in. So I got answers like, it would be really great if we had a hook at our meetings, like some kind of formal something to make sure that I did the work I was supposed to do. Or so that was one of the people who's up here as an isolate who nobody reported connections with and who didn't report connections with anybody. So there's a little bit of a, you get what you get on that. So the reason, when you look at the advice of this network as well, you very much get the same kind of story, where you see lots of different clusters of schools, but not a lot of conversation across the network. So what this tells me is that this network is learning to be a network versus network H, where you see really dense connections, and we know that the denser the connections, the denser the conversations, the more challenging the conversations, the more able those networks are to do the type of problem solving that is required of something like educational change, which I don't need to tell you is incredibly complex. So the richer the conversation, the better. And so for these networks, both are about the same age, not quite, but the important question to ask about this when we're looking at a network or a group of schools is, so why are they different, and why does it matter? One part is time. It takes time to learn to work together as schools, and that's something that LCN has been very good about being flexible about, and saying, you know, this is going to take some time, and facilitation has been trying to calibrate that difference of, you know, what's a tolerable amount of messiness? At what point do you need to get on with it, and at what point do we kind of need to let you figure it out? And that's a real piece of the facilitation of the LCN strategy. I would suggest from this case study, and as well as the other networks that I've been working with, that jumping in, boots into the teacher-driven, teacher collaboration activities are a huge plus for a network. When I asked Network H, the very, very dense network, what was the tipping point in getting you guys to trust each other? Everybody said, at some respect, oh, it was when we actually got in each other's classrooms, and we had to be vulnerable, and we had to put our data out there, and that was uncomfortable, but it got us to have really deep conversations. Whereas if you'll remember with Network G, they started very much principal level and had a lot of conversations there, and are starting to get it down to teacher level. But many of the principals said, we're not ready to do that yet. So I would really emphasize the importance of getting this down to the teacher level rather than simply at the principal level. As I mentioned, density, the tightness of that network, means problem-solving power. The trust and challenge in the network, both of those networks rated their trust very highly and were very consistent in that trust, with the exception of those that were on the periphery of the group in that more group of schools network. The people who were on the periphery were much more likely to say, oh, I'm not totally willing to share data with this group yet, for instance. The challenge, like I said, in that first group, multiple challenger folks. I also asked questions about who is most influential on your practice. There were multiple people that popped through in that first network. There was one person that popped through in that second network. And to the point about internal accountability, when I talked about the hook, people on the periphery of that second network were much more likely to say things like, I don't know, I mean, we can do this or we can not do it. And we find it valuable, so we do it, but it would be nice if, we had a little bit more of some push. Whereas those in the middle were like, I totally think of these people when I'm making decisions in my school. This is very important to me. These people are core to what I do every day. It's not a layer on top. So I use these two networks as an example of some of the dynamics that the learning and change networks are working with as they're moving from being individual self-managing schools to working together. And to working together not only as schools, but with the communities and with the families and with the students as well, which is not an added layer, but a new way of doing things for many of these schools. So what you're looking at here is my interpretation from the 7 networks that I've worked with of where they fall on a distributed leadership scale. So if we think of 2 different ways of looking at distributed leadership, we can think of it vertically. Is it principal-driven or is it more teacher-driven? And we can look at it horizontally, as in, is there a core group of schools that's leading the work in this network, or is it pretty evenly spread across? It's important to note also that I got this is a mix of the survey data, the maps, and my qualitative interviews. So this is by no means a precise measure. This is my interpretation of it, and I would welcome the conversation about it as well. So focusing more on the quadrants than the actual placement of the schools. Two of the networks are very, very flat in a good way. Very, very teacher-driven. They really view this as core to everything that they do, Network H being one of those. The majority of the networks that I worked with, and many others that I didn't work with formally but had conversations with, are still up in this upper quadrant where it's a little more principle-driven, and there's a core group that's kind of running the work, which is, we have to consider the continuum of where schools are as they progress through this. That's a very important point to make sure of, but all of the networks I've been working with have been together for at least a year. And so when I go back to that question of what's a tolerable amount of messiness, and working with the facilitation, at what point do we say it's time to get the teachers involved in this? So a thought as moving into future communities of schools. Network A is all by its lonesome over in the corner over here, and worth talking about because it's very principal-led, very active group of principals who are doing great things with putting a trust together to fund Chromebooks and technology, for instance, and are working across schools to build a profile of what a learner in their area looks like. But when I did surveys and talked with some of the teachers in those schools, I got answers like, what is LCN for you? Oh, well, it's a handout in our staff room, and we go over it once a month. So that's not a teacher-owned network, and that's likely not making classroom shifts for some of those schools. Again, this is qualitative, and I didn't do this systematically, but that was a flag for me. And if the goal is to make classroom shifts that are affecting students, we have to think about that aspect of things. So with that in mind, in thinking about what are the, going back this way first, in thinking about what would it take to get this group and to get whatever percentage of the networks that are still up in this quadrant to move towards this lower quadrant where we've got broader buy-in and more of a teacher and student-driven aspect of things. What would it take? What part of that is simply psychology, is simply personality, is simply the dynamics that I've shown you? And what part of that is policy or structure? That's something that I think the minds in this room can probably think about much more deeply than I can in the next few years, and I know it's something you'll be thinking about. So I would really welcome the conversation about what that would take as we finish up. So I've mentioned this before, but a key recommendation for me around the networks is getting this to the teacher level as fast as possible. It's going to be uncomfortable, but the payoffs are huge. And for the networks that did that work, they point to it as a key piece of their networking environment, and it's helped them get to students faster by getting the teachers involved early. And to the point of balancing ownership versus expertise, a key feature of the LCN strategy versus previous strategies, like I talked about, is moving from expertise is external, and we learn from expertise over here, and then we do what they tell us, to moving to an ownership model where we're saying, well, we can diagnose our own challenges and ask for the help that we need, which is a shift, and it's a hard way of working. But does that mean we leave expertise in our dust? Not necessarily. So in thinking about that tolerable level of messiness moving forward, many of the schools that I was working with were frustrated at the beginning of their time with how little guidance that they had. And now they feel like they, by and large, feel like they can manage this on their own, but they very strongly communicated to me that more structure at the beginning of their time was very important. And so I'll talk about in the recommendations why facilitation has a big role to play in that, and how if schools are coming together without that facilitation support, that things could be quite messy, maybe intolerably messy. So two things that we'll hop into from here. So thus far we've been talking about the structure of implementing an idea, or the structure and the social structure that goes into implementing a policy or implementing a program. And that's important, obviously. I spent a year on it. But the substance of the idea still matters an awful lot. What you don't want with any kind of collaboration is a groupthink engine, which is why I ask about challenge. Though you want a group of schools that are able to diagnose problems and implement solutions with like a well-oiled efficiency, what you want to be very careful about, obviously, is a snake-oiled efficiency where, groups are adopting things without fully checking them against the best evidence that we have of whether it works for kids. So what I call this is, to borrow Michael Fullen's term, the ready, fire, aim dilemma. So in Michael Fullen's book, he talks about, you don't have the best way to get into innovation is simply to do it and figure it out as you go. And there's real pros to that, obviously. But readiness, the ready part of that ready, fire, aim, I would contend, still requires checking things against your best evidence of what works for kids, what works for your kids, but also what we know from learning science research and broader research around what works for kids. And when I acknowledge, of course, the contextual aspect of that, but many of my conversations with facilitators and with principals noted a concern that checking process wasn't happening as robustly as it could, or that facilitators could have played maybe more of a role in putting research in front of somebody. And I know that as part of the ownership shift, that part of that is guiding somebody to that research rather than plopping it in their face. But many of the networks pointed out, and the facilitators pointed out, that this role of research is still a very important one, and one that should be in part of the conversation. And one of the personal concerns that I would like to raise for the group and have a conversation about is, when we say with learning environments and the Innovative Learning Environment Project, how do you learn best? When we ask on the learning maps, how are you learning best? Let's be really specific about what do we mean by how. I would contend that the how you learn best question is the million-dollar question, right? That's what we are all trying to figure out. As somebody said, talking about the shifts he'd made with his students, he said, I've been a teacher for 10 years and I never thought to ask them how they learn best. That's not a rocket science question. That's true, but it is to some extent a cognitive science question. And in my conversations, I've been a bit concerned that people are confusing the how, the cognitive piece that is in fact, in some respects, very similar for all students, with questions of motivation or questions of interest or questions of preferences. So the point that how you learn best, we actually know some stuff about with cognitive science and maybe should be checking it. But what do you learn, and with whom, and with what, and when you learn, which are the types of questions that come out with learning maps, and under what conditions that you learn, are distinct and different questions, and we should be careful about how we approach that. Dan Willingham is a cognitive scientist from the University of Virginia, and he wrote a great book called Why Don't Students Like School that outlines 9 principles of what we know about how the mind works, or our best evidence so far about what we think the mind works. And I raised this to point out where we might have tensions between a shift towards future-focused learning and the best evidence we have of how the mind works. They're not insurmountable, but they're things that we should be aware of, the tensions between them. One key point is, in moving towards future-focused learning, we're talking about moving from content to more of a process. We're talking of moving from stuff to learning more about 21st century skills. But you cannot develop thinking skills, you cannot develop skills without facts. They are intrinsically together. So when we talk about things like building 21st century skills or building reading comprehension skills, it's important to note that the background knowledge that a child brings to that conversation, or the actual what that those skills are being applied to, are intrinsically linked. And so I've heard it's a bit of a straw man, but I have heard quite a few times things like, in the future you'll be able to look up the information that you need, so it's not as important that you have the stuff, it's more important that you have the ability to find it. And while there is some truth to that, obviously, there's still an important aspect of learning stuff. So the stuff still matters, basically. So as we move forward into future-focused learning and think about a personalized path for students where they are picking the material that they study, I would put a strong onus on making sure that the stuff that kids are choosing to learn is very much in keeping with the curriculum and very much in keeping with what we know about how students and people learn, which is that knowledge is cumulative and builds on a series of content. So something to keep in mind. Another aspect of this is in a future-focused, more personalized environment, we have the teacher as facilitator role. And so one of the things that's really popped out in my conversations has been that what people mean by teacher as facilitator has a real continuum to it. Some think of that as quite unguided in many ways, of saying students can do this, I'm going to step back and be very light touch. Others, and I would argue those that, though I don't have the data to back this up, but those that seem to be moving things along very well with their students and continuing to get excellent outcomes, are, quote, rigging it for success. That's a term that I've heard a lot. Still a lot of direct teaching happening. Students have choices, but the choices are structured rigorously so that they can't choose a non-rigorous choice. So it's a shift to ownership for those students, but still in a way that ensures that they're getting a rich curriculum and that they're advancing through at a pace and on a path that is going to ultimately get them to a place that they are motivated by, but also ensures that they're ready for college, they're ready for university possibly, and especially in the primary ages where we don't know that student's future, so we need to make sure that we get that student as rigorous a curriculum as possible. So I raise all of these points just to say learning science certainly has a role in this conversation. It has all the more of a role as we move into the types of innovation with digital technologies and with teachers, facilitator types of pedagogies. All the more important to check this against the best evidence that we have and to recognize when perhaps our best evidence doesn't know things yet and we can play a role in evaluating. But having that check-in is something that popped through quite strongly for me as something that perhaps isn't happening as robustly as it should. In a similar vein of we don't always know what we don't know and making sure that we're keeping things rigorous, one of the real gems from Learning and Change Network is its approach to evaluation in bringing qualitative information to the conversation. So networks typically, when they're involved with a ministry outcome, will be reporting student data, they may be reporting other survey data, but that's really the end of the story. What Learning and Change is doing is building a very rich database of qualitative information. Those may be videos of students, the students talking about their learning. You've got the learning maps, all manner of evaluative surveys that the schools are themselves putting together and submitting to the Ministry of Education. So what that does is creates a very rich conversation for measuring some of the things that we don't really know how to measure yet that Learning and Change is trying to do around the lateral learning, around the types of things that I've attempted to measure in some ways. I would put a caution though that this is a valuable and a transformational in many ways a way of approaching evaluation, but it does not substitute for very rigorous external evaluation. And because Learning and Change has so many different moving parts, with families, working with communities, working with student agency, working with 21st century digital strategies, all of these things, when you come at the end of the day and you look at your national standards data, how do you know what aspect of that worked? Is continuing to be a big question for me, because I have no doubt that aspects of it are absolutely doing great things for kids, but what are those aspects? And this is a real role for independent, rigorous evaluation studies that try and get at those mechanisms. But Learning and Change in its focus on ownership has often said, well, if this tool doesn't fit you, then don't do it, which on the one hand is a great thing. They'll often say, okay, well, if you're not going to do this evaluative tool, build your own. We would love to see that. And schools have done that in some cases. In other cases, they've simply not done the evaluation. So a caution to make sure that we are avoiding self-affirmation in those qualitative narratives that are coming forward, and making sure that there's still an independent and a rigorous focus on evaluation. Because learning and change, as part of the OECD Innovative Learning Environment Strategy, has a lot to teach us, has a lot to teach the world about how to move student engagement. And I want to make sure that the things that are working out of LCN, we know what those are at the end of the day, that we're able to say something about that. And right now, we'll have a very rich qualitative narrative, and coming forth in 2015, we'll have more of the student data around that. I would love to see more rigorous evaluations around connecting all of those things. So, the fun part. For those of you who are involved in investing in educational success, how might this inform the communities of schools that are coming forward? For those of you who aren't familiar, the Investing in Educational Success policy has been touted as a huge shift in schooling in New Zealand from the Tomorrow's Schools Act that made things quite self-managing, so individual autonomous schools. Investing in educational success is making real moves towards saying, well, collaboration is going to be the new normal, and what will that look like? Many of these recommendations I've already talked about, so I'll go over them fairly quickly, but schools need facilitation for this. The type of facilitation is going to differ. Schools that are signing on to the LCN strategy are already quite willing and quite interested in signing on to this ownership kind of model, and signing on to a model where they're working with families and students very closely. Other schools that may be doing this for other methods or motivations, or don't have a history of working together and maybe aren't as interested in the student-centered approach that Learning and Change Network takes, they're still going to need facilitation. So as IES and the communities of schools move forward, I would very strongly suggest that if it's not mandated, at least very strongly encourage that schools seek facilitation support. They can choose the method of that, but they should have some support in doing that, because facilitators have a real role in creating those challenging conversations and pushing the schools to get to the teacher level, for instance. They can provide research and evaluation support, and they can create a cross-pollination among the different schools that they're working with. That an expert principal, or the terms have changed a little bit, but the principal who is already working in their own school and is coming out may not be able to offer that type of facilitation role. I should note before moving forward that if you want a more granular discussion about where investing in educational success and LCN meet, I would suggest that you head to Rose Patterson's report with the NZ initiative. It's called No School is an Island, and it really gets into the details of IES and how LCN plays in. And she and I certainly agree on this facilitation point, I think. As I've said, emphasizing teacher-level collaboration. I can't emphasize that enough, really. Getting that down to the student and teacher level. And creating an expectation of evidence and evaluation moving forward. As teachers are coming forth for the Teacher Innovation Fund, for instance, making sure that innovation and best evidence are given equal weight in that conversation. So, with that all said, hopefully I've given you a bit of a snapshot of where LCN is moving, where LCN is heading, and some of the stumbling blocks, as well as some of the tremendous opportunities that are coming forward for LCN. What I would love to have now is to have a chance for some of you who are participating in LCN to talk a little bit and ask some questions as well. So I'll turn it back over to, it sounds like we have an ombudsman for questions, since Bill is standing up.
I'm going to manage that, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, Sarah. And in actual fact, I'd just like to say I had the very good fortune about a month or 3 weeks ago of going to a Learning and Change Network meeting with a group of principals, and I think that must have been an H network.
An H conversation.
Because I was very impressed with the enthusiasm and the passion and the willingness to collaborate among those leaders. And it's interesting to use that word leaders, because not just principals but deputies and teachers, and as I say, teacher driven, because it was the actual network was actually managed by a deputy principal rather than a principal, and I was very impressed with that collaborative feeling. And as Sarah has mentioned, the move from self-managing schools to a more collaborative approach is what is driving the Learning and Change Network, and is obviously driving the IES too, it's clear. So very stimulating, very interesting to see those diagrams and the diagrams between those two networks. And I, sitting there as a person working in the field, linking, I know that one, I know that one. So
Don't
I know I don't, but it was very interesting to move from competitive kind of model to a collaborative model, and I'm seeing it working, and it's very exciting and very innovative. Look, now that I'm sure that people will have questions that they want to ask Sarah. So, take questions now.
Amy?
Hi. So I was just curious, between the networks that were sort of closer, like tight-knit, was there any sort of correlation that you could see to student achievement in those networks?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
I did not attempt to connect things directly to student achievement because part of it is we don't have that longitudinal data in some cases, and in many of the networks they've been working together for a while, or they've been working on other projects before they came into LCN. So isolating that work is the type of rigorous evaluation that I would like to see happen. For those, I mean, we have two Roses who have done more work with the student achievement piece of it. I would say, in my anecdotal evidence, that the student level shifts, that the teacher level shifts, I would hypothesize would be higher. I don't have the claim to say that really, though. What would be interesting for me to see is when there is a longer trail of student data, to actually be able to go back to these maps and kind of look at what's happening. But for those of you who, the two Roses and others who are actually working with the student data more closely, would that track with, would that hypothesis make sense to you?
Any other questions?
Fair enough.
Anything else? You must have given us so much information, Sarah, that we're a bit overwhelmed with the kind. And isn't it wonderful to see such passion? And I feel very comfortable that this innovation that is being developed here and that you've reported on is going to be shared back in the United States when you return, and even internationally. So I'm very thrilled. And well, thank you very much for coming and sharing that with us, Sarah. It's been very enlightening, and as I say, I from the Ministry and my colleagues from the Ministry will be delighted to hear such a positive spin put on what is an exciting
I was like, spin doctor there.
What an exciting thrust on such a very innovative program.